I'm now just going to take the mantle here and transition to our next panel, where we are going to focus on medium duty and heavy duty. So if we could, it would be great if the panelists could join and come on so we can start the panel, and I'll do a little brief intro. And I'm not seeing folks yet, but I'll give you all a moment to join. And while you're joining, I will do a little brief intro on the goal of the panel. So we're going to talk a little bit about medium duty and heavy duty electrification. And we offered it briefly, and I think Sue mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, that the Electrification Coalition has started to do a bunch of work to focus on helping to accelerate medium duty and heavy duty electrification. It's the freight sector is a very small percentage of the on-road vehicles, but is an incredibly high percentage of the of both fuel use, the pollution, the GHG emissions. And so this is an incredible opportunity as we think about our transportation electrification future to solve a lot of problems. The other part is that when we get into the freight sector, the difference between freight in many ways with an internal combustion engine versus freight that's electrified is the batteries, a lot of the component systems, the electric motors actually end up being very similar or the same as we go from light duty to medium duty to heavy duty. And so really the idea here is that we can actually build up our industry at scale and not only meet the goals and efforts that we've talked a lot about with light duty, but also meeting the goals and efforts that are focused around the heavy duty transportation electrification. And we've, from our own personal experience, there's a ton of renewed interest or not renewed, but growing interest, I should say, in the opportunity. And it really is a place where there's a great leadership opportunity for the U.S. We have an incredibly large and powerful and active freight sector. And in fact, in some cases, with the growth in the movement of goods and delivery that we've seen through COVID, the freight sector and logistics and that kind of delivery services continue to expand and grow. And so in some ways, there's no greater opportunity or no greater time needed than to focus on accelerating freight electrification than right now. I think we are also going to see some of those efforts and some of that work start to happen at the federal level, but we're already starting to see state policy develop around freight electrification. And so this is a great time to have this discussion with everybody that's participating from Wisconsin. So with that, I'm going to, I think in this case, in the opening, I'm going to ask if each of the speakers could take the same question and briefly introduce yourself and who you're from. And in this case, if you could just start with, what are you most excited about in transitioning public fleets to EVs in Wisconsin? So if I could, why don't I start with, and I'm just going to call it out. Pat, can you start?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Ben. Hi. Yeah, thanks. I'm Pat Hayes. I'm with ABB's e-mobility division. ABB makes the charging infrastructure that we've been talking about, the chargers for all. We're a global supplier. 20,000 DC fast chargers have been installed globally, and will continue to do so. So that's where I fit into the picture here. What am I most excited about? Living in Wisconsin for the last 14 years and working in it longer than that, I've noticed a few things. Wisconsin's got a great outdoors. Every town has either a lake or a river running through it. It's beautiful to get out to the state parks. I mean, it's a beautiful country, and because of that, we have a lot of natural resources. It was great to hear some words about renewable energy, solar, wind has been brought up, things like that. I'd like to work in energy storage types of things. But what that does is it's got the energy costs are quite low here. What a great, if you look at all these and then with our industrial and fleet operators here in the state, what great drivers for electrification. We've got everything moving in the right direction. So that's what's excited for me.
Great. Kara, would you take the next one? And I guess as a reference point, my 3-year-old's name is Kara, so I don't see it a ton. So I'll have to tell her that I was talking to a fellow Kara today.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Hopefully your Kara will live in a world where there's many more EVs than our world right now. So hi, everyone. I'm Kara Pratt. I'm the Sustainability and Conservation Coordinator for the City of Racine. And what excites me most about this transition is changing minds and changing our municipal fleet culture. In many of our public institutions and in larger society, there are doubts about these technologies and there is range anxiety. And here in Racine, we're slowly combating that. In my 2 years in this role, as Secretary Brennan mentioned before, we've secured funding for 9 Proterra electric buses, which will be delivered at the end of this year. We've installed the largest solar installation to date in the city. And we also just installed our first public solar electric vehicle charging station in City Hall's parking lot last month. And that's been used every single day for the past 9 days straight. So we're doing our best, and I'm so excited to be here today.
Great. Yeah, and my kid actually so far has never, this sounds really super elitist-y somewhat somehow, but has never actually been to a gas station. So I'm hoping I can make that a reality for her entire life. That's actually not true. She's gotten some candy, some junk food from there, but maybe that's how all she'll know for it. So next, could I have Todd go?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. My name is Todd McBride. I'm with Rosenbauer. Rosenbauer is kind of we are the world's leading manufacturer of fire apparatus. We build about 4,000 trucks a year. And I guess this is what I'm most excited about. And actually, I'm going to back up a little bit. You know, our journey into EV started about 10 years ago. And it was our goal to develop the fire truck of the future. But in doing so, the goal was to solve a lot of pain points that firefighters face on a daily basis, you know, health and safety issues, ergonomics, maneuverability. It was never really the intention to develop an electric fire truck. It just so happens that electric solved a lot of our issues in the R&D and engineering process. So I guess for us, maybe to back up or answer the original question, you know, we're most excited about bringing all these new features and health and safety benefits to the firefighter, maneuverability, ergonomics, but also I guess to be able to do that electrically we're really excited about that because it does solve a lot of issues that fire departments face on a daily basis.
Earlier, we needed you when the lieutenant governor's fire alarm was going off and disrupted the flow of our session. So pretty exciting to see that we can plug in a fire truck.
Yeah, absolutely.
So next, I'd love it if Rosalyn could go.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Rosalyn Jeffries, and I'm an analyst at Amply Power. It's just some background. We provide charging software to optimize charging solutions for fleets that are looking to transition to electrification. And what we're most excited about transitioning public fleets in Wisconsin is having these municipalities and other public entities unlock the cost-saving potential of electrification. As Pat mentioned earlier, electric rates in Wisconsin are incredibly competitive with traditional fossil fueling. And particularly after the past year, we know that our public entities are a bit cash strapped. And so being able to deliver a solution for their fleets that saves them money while minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and continuing to optimize and have operational excellence for delivering people, goods, and services is a great solution to provide for the people of Wisconsin.
Great. And wrapping it up here, Orville, if you could lastly introduce Lion and yourself.
Yeah, hey everyone. Thank you to Electrification Coalition for having me and the other panelists talk about this. My name is Orville Thomas. I'm the new Government Relations Director for Lion Electric. We are a fully electric manufacturer of medium and heavy duty vehicles. You'll see a lot of our electric school buses on the road. We have about 400 currently serving communities all throughout the United States and in Canada. What I'm most excited about, and I think Neda talked about a lot of this, is equity. You know, where electrification and where this transportation conversation will go into communities that are unfortunately, you know, kind of overlooked. And it isn't just communities of color, even though it might be disproportionately communities of color, but it's also rural communities that struggle to get these technologies and to have cleaner air for their children. So as Lion is looking to get more electric school buses out, we really have these conversations with local partners about what we can do to make sure that everyone has a chance to breathe clean air and that, you know, the next generation does grow up with a lot better technology than what we do have right now.
Yeah, I think Neda did a great job of helping frame up that one of the growing issues that I think really brings a ton of attention to electrification. It is the idea that we can not only solve the economic and national security impacts of our oil dependency, but also obviously the idea of localized air pollution and how that affects so many communities so deeply, and that electrification can solve that problem. So, well, thank you all for your introductions. We have a great panel. I got a little overexcited about the idea of medium duty and heavy duty, and in some ways started the panel with a little bit of false pretense. So this is really a focus around medium duty, heavy duty, but also fleet electrification. And so that's why you heard from a diverse group of panelists that are from the city, from the industry side, and I think are going to do a great job of helping share a little bit about sort of where things are headed. Maybe for all of you as panelists, earlier when we started, we did a quick poll, and a lot of the people that are on the webinar today might be in their first 2 years of kind of entering into transportation electrification. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to ask some of those kinds of questions that when people are learning about these, as we go onto this journey, some of the ways that you all are coming into this and thinking about the solutions. And so one of those that I think is a question that comes up a lot is, what challenges are you most concerned about? And what role can state policy play in addressing those? And so I'm going to kind of reverse order here this a little bit. And Orville, if you could take the first crack at that question, I'd love to have you answer it.
Yeah, thank you. The challenge that I think of is that we keep putting off the investments and think of this as like a strategy that, isn't necessary for right now. There's a study, I think, that showed that we're 40% closer to overpassing the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. And so the time is now, right, to act. We don't have more time to just hold off. And so when we think about investments, we can't let, the nature of governments, especially at the state and local level, overtake the needs of the community. We need to invest now, we need to invest early, and we need those benefits to start really happening almost immediately for us to be able to really get all the benefits out of electrification, either at the economic level, but mostly at the health level.
Great. And we have something the Electrification Coalition has started is the Electrification Coalition Business Council. And so Amply is one of the members of that, as our Lion. And really appreciate your guys' ongoing engagement and support. But Rosalyn, love to hear your thoughts on the state policy opportunities and how do we solve some of the challenges.
Sure. Well, yes, it's been, as you mentioned, it's been great to be on the Electrification Coalition Business Council and to be able to collaborate with other firms in this industry. But particularly on state policy, we've seen a lot of states pay attention to the vehicle side of electrification, which of course drives all this conversation, but we need more attention being paid to charging infrastructure. And that requires engagement with the utilities, engagement with the site host, whether that's a depot or in a more public area. It requires discussions with many, many stakeholders, and just focusing on the vehicle side can leave a large capital expenditure just kind of waiting to sneak up on these municipalities. And part of that is also the discussion of what type of charging strategy you want to have. Is it you want to optimize for uptime, you want to optimize for fueling costs, you want to optimize for reliability, and by putting that off and only focusing on the vehicles, whether it's through state funding programs or state legislature on standardization or optimization, it pushes off really important conversations that municipalities need to have.
So it just feels like, because we've been talking about municipalities, we need to go to Kara here. And I do think, municipalities are right in the middle of this, where not only is it the state policy, but I think you could even add in a little bit of the local policy side. There's cities like Charlotte who have created an EV purse policy. So it actually flips the script and says, we're going to buy EVs and have to prove that they don't work to meet our operational needs. But how are you viewing, and how's Racine sort of thinking about some of the policy opportunities?
Thanks, Ben. You're right that this is something that local governments really do need to take leadership on and consider. And for us, it's involved a whole lot of learning. I mean, I'm one of those people who has just under 2 years of experience working in this sector. And I can say the same for our fleet manager and for our transit manager. So we're all in this process learning together. And we see what other cities do in doing light projects and light pole projects that have to do with electric vehicle charging. And also we have to consider our zoning and parking requirements and how we can get new development to also include electric vehicle charging as a requirement for new construction. And so those are all policy changes that we really need to implement so that we can all be on the same page in terms of electric vehicle readiness. And then at the same time, our city has to take leadership to buy fleet vehicles. So we have, as I mentioned before, made really considerable progress with our transit fleet. But with our own municipal fleet, we have yet to purchase a single electric vehicle. And I think that there is just a lot of fear among our own staff about how to make that work for us.
Well, I appreciate the leadership of the City of Racine on the front, and the idea that fleet vehicles really can represent the sort of way to move the market and help show that proof of concept. If they work at a city level, they're going to work for consumers, and I think that's a really important way to show and have that be a real demonstration. But Todd, maybe I imagine people probably weren't thinking fire trucks were going to be on the list today for electric vehicles. So how are you all approaching state policy opportunities?
Yeah, I guess to kind of build on that is we've been on a nationwide tour with our what we call our concept fire truck. And as we visit cities, all these fire departments are being faced with mandates coming down from leadership, where their vehicles, they want the fleet of the vehicles to be either a third or, half fully or half electric by 2030, 2035. And so for them, if they don't start that now, for a department that potentially has a couple hundred vehicles, if they don't start that process now, they are going to be playing catch up. The challenge that they're facing is they are already playing catch up from not purchasing vehicles over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think the number is nearly 50% of the vehicles are already past their replacement schedule. So the departments are, it's a funding issue. And so they're faced with the issue, do we try to get our existing fleet up to speed, or do we go invest in new technology in the EV world? And with the new technology, as we all know, it's more expensive. While the total cost of ownership over a 20-year lifespan of a fire truck is going to be less, with fuel savings and maintenance. It's bridging that gap from what a traditional fire truck would cost to what an EV fire truck would cost. And so that's the challenge that we're seeing out in the field is, how do departments access federal funding, state funding to invest in these new technologies and get started on their EV journey.
I think there's a lot of you have brought up this idea of the CapEx versus OpEx, or capital expenditures versus operational expenditures. And it is interesting because, those budgets were developed without EVs in mind, right? They were really dealing with the idea of lowest cost imperative at the time of purchase. And so you buy the cheapest vehicle. But I really, in the idea of using tax dollars in the best possible way, we have to help everyone kind of rethink what that system looks like. And there's challenges because inherently there's things like non-appropriations requirements that exist for city and state budgets that say you can't actually enter into a contract or a budget that goes beyond the budget cycle. And so those are real things, but I think we are all realizing we have to review those. We have to think about how we can maybe change those systems so that we do prioritize total cost of operation, and even starting to think about some of those other costs that exist, health costs, right? The impacts of national economic security and so on and so forth. So Pat, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think obviously you all are engaged in the infrastructure side. So as Kara talked about range anxiety, which I like to say range uncertainty, I think it is really a way to think about it. Chargers are not as obvious as big gas stations, but how's ABB viewing state policy opportunity?
Well, yeah, a couple of things there, and I'll just kind of grow from what the panelists, my teammates there have been talking about. Think about it this way. You started hitting on it too. The processes, even of the fleet operators, have been in place for many years with diesel and managing that, the fuel sites, their wash sites, their maintenance sites. And so changing to EV, it does kind of tip the apple cart here. So it's got to be a nice process to do that. But that also, helps create opportunity here to, change the game from that capital versus operational cost structure and policies to help with that. So that's probably what I can add to that question there.
Great.
Everyone else has talked about.
Well, going last on that on one question is always in some ways the hardest position. So, sometimes it's easiest to just kind of go what they said.
Yeah.
So, well, maybe just to, come back to the city of Racine. How would you describe some of those early stage infrastructure, deployment challenges? What are you seeing from maybe some of your other municipal partners and how you're engaging with them, and what needs more attention?
Thanks, Ben. So we had to learn really quickly how badly we needed data. And so we went on a data hunt at the beginning of this process. And there's actually some folks on this call who helped us with that data. And so here in the city of Racine, 22% of our municipal carbon footprint can be attributed to fuel. That's 12% from fleet and 10% from transit. So 22% of our whole carbon footprint is from fuel. That's wild. And eventually that has to be zero. We all recognize that it has to be zero. And so in order to get there, we've had to conduct a number of different studies in order to understand what is kind of the lowest hanging fruit in this regard. So we did conduct a study for our transit that would identify the vehicles and the routes that would be most appropriate for electrification now. And so we handled those with those 9 electric buses. Those are the 9 routes that can be handled right now. But then in the future, we still have 30 something buses that would need to be either the bus would have to be a different kind of bus, the charging would have to be inter-route charging, or we're gonna have to change our routes. And so we've done kind of the easy part on the transit side, and now we just need more data to do the other parts of it. And so we're now in the business of collecting as much data as possible. That also, I think, is going to help convince some other entities like public safety, like fire, that some of the technologies that my co-panelists offer are also appropriate for them too.
So maybe just to go right back to you, Pat, so that you aren't last this time. How is ABB sort of thinking about helping cities solve some of these infrastructure challenges and starting to work with them?
Yeah, so I can't use just what they said already. Some of the challenges when you're building the charging infrastructure is we don't know, the OEMs, we have to match up with every OEM globally and know how to, when they plug in, we can charge and charge it safely and reliably. And what's happening is the use cases are also changing. The flow through the depot, the dwell time in the depot, or on route charging or in depot charging. And so matching up the charging technology to match with the use case also is very important right now, and to help enable strategies and allow Kara to do more strategy in her route operations and charging time. And then probably the last thing that's been is just matching up with uptime and availability expectations. That is so easy to maybe miss the mark if we don't talk and collaborate early on. Because Kara's got customers to get around. Make sure that they get from point A to point B, and every every use case has got that, and the heavy vehicle market has got that type of thing. So in making sure that do we want a guy sitting there with a wrench to be able to fix it fast, or do you want to have redundant chargers or something in between? Managing that and making sure it meets expectations. So
yeah, and I think there's there's sort of an interesting we're just tapping into the potential here, and I think sometimes we don't even realize where there could be value. So there's things like vehicle to grid, where school buses, we had that conversation earlier, if you saw the doctor talking about that, but those are great examples where we literally then have this mobile power system, right, that then when it's not cleanly and more cheaply and in some case better carting our kids around to school, they can actually plug into the grid and act as some of that demand response. So when we have things like what happened in Texas, maybe in this case, if we had a bunch of school buses that were electric, Texas might not have experienced some of the challenges and costs that they had. But curious, Rosalyn, to think about amply in your role on the infrastructure side, if there's more you would add about the way that the infrastructure is changing and how that's going to help solve some of these problems.
Right. I'll pick up on something Pat mentioned in terms of the needs for standardization across charging standards in vehicles, so that cities and fleets can pick chargers without having to worry whether it fits the vehicles and not having to navigate proprietary standards and operating systems. We've had discussions with fleets where, don't get me wrong, it makes Amply look really good when we know how to distinguish that actually you can't put that charger with that vehicle, but for cities and fleets across the country, it needs to be simpler than that. And then to go back to the CapEx versus OpEx discussion, what we've done is we think we can help fleets with the charging as a service solution in which we turn that capital expenditure for charging infrastructure of installation, deployment, commissioning, testing, procurement, and turn it into a usage model of a price per kilowatt hour dispense, so that particularly with public fleets, it turns only into an operational expense rather than this huge CapEx expense, which Todd talked about previously with the vehicles. And it helps make this transition a bit more manageable without having to deploy millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars to begin with.
Yeah, there's the idea that I have to talk to somebody about what J1772 is versus CHAdeMO versus CCS is just, it's like one of these things where unless you're plugging a car in, that feels super intimidating, right? The reality is that those things are actually pretty easy to understand very quickly. And even why to think about a level 2 solution versus a DC fast charger. Again, all of those, if you're new to the space, can feel really intimidating, but in some ways it can be very simple. Like a DC fast charger just charges the vehicle way faster and allows for that direct current to happen, versus a level 2, which is much more like a dryer that most people arrange that you have in your household, and it's the same kind of power. And so sometimes we have to work to de-nerdify some of our work, and I think as we've built it out through engineers, we don't always call things that make it easy for people to sort of understand and understand that stuff. So maybe just to kind of move on to back to the medium duty, heavy duty side of things. And I saw it on a LinkedIn post that there was a company called Pratt that bought or placed an order for a bunch of Lion electric vehicles, and the comment made me chuckle that they now have a pride of lions, I think is how they articulated it. But curious if maybe Orville, you could share a little bit more about the different class of vehicles that you all are making, and maybe a couple of places where they're even already on the road, just so people have a little bit of perspective that it's here and now.
Yeah, and shout out to the Pride social media team for really getting punny with all of that. So if you're not familiar with Lion, we've been in the news over the last 6 to 8 months for some of our arrangements and sales to very large distributors, mostly our class 6 chassis and truck. So Amazon has an agreement to buy 2,500 Lion class 6 trucks to help with their middle mile delivery. It's going to be a huge opportunity for Amazon as they look to go to zero in terms of their carbon footprint and their transportation emissions. Pride is a great example of international and in Canada, what we could do in partnership. There is also an agreement with IKEA in Canada to have some of our class 6 trucks to help with their delivery in certain markets for their IKEA Canada brand. And so what we're trying to do is just make sure that we involve ourselves, and I'm sure other OEMs are thinking the same thing. Those manufacturing partnerships with delivery companies is the best way that we can really attack our climate goals and making sure that we actually have them achievable. So when we have opportunities to really partner with companies that have a lot of their deliveries that are looking to transition to electric, what we have to do as OEMs, especially as Lion, is really show them, like, get behind the wheel and allow them to have an experience, because sometimes they don't understand that electric is just as simple as getting behind the wheel and starting the car and then, putting the pedal to the metal. And that's why we're really excited that we're going to be able to do a lot of this in several states. Actually, tomorrow in California, in Sacramento, we're having a Lion Class 6 ride and drive event. We're going to put some of these Class 6 trucks at the California State Capitol next week and allow legislators to get a look at them. And we'll probably be doing the same thing in Wisconsin, and especially through the Midwest and the Southeast. We want legislators to know that these trucks are available. They are, as Todd kind of said, like, the cost might be a lot in the start, but they become a lot cheaper over the long run. And that if we could allow them to think of future technology available in the present then we could really re-educate them on what medium and heavy duty EVs are and why we really need to invest in them now. And I see Kara nodding, so I'm hoping that the City of Racine is also thinking along those lines of early investments on medium and heavy duty.
A lot of times when we get into transportation electrification, there's always these performance metrics that people love to talk about, because you have 100% torque at 0 RPM, right? And so what that means is like it'll go really fast. That's basically the gist. But I think about the idea of the fire truck and wonder about if that same kind of acceleration metric holds true. But Todd, I'm curious, and that probably isn't really something you're going to answer right now. Although maybe you're clocking the 0 to 60 time, and we can get to fires faster in an electric fire truck. But just interested how people are responding to the idea of a fire truck, and how does having it be electric potentially create other opportunities, power systems that can be there, right? Plugging into the truck when it's on site.
Yeah, certainly. And to your point, I mean, a fire truck does just that. I mean, in a city, it's going from intersection to intersection. And with a diesel engine, we're ramping up, we're hitting the brakes, we're ramping up, we're hitting the brakes. So the fact that when we're hitting the accelerator and we have instant torque, you can get to the fire quicker. But that being said, how is it being received? I've heard this term quite a few times today, but range anxiety is probably the #1 question we get from firefighters is, a delivery van or whatever, if it runs out of battery, it can stop and recharge. What happens if I'm fighting a fire and I'm going to be there all night long? So that's the #1 question we generally get. And so we have generally we have two 50 kilowatt hour batteries on the truck. And so that gives us about an hour and a half to 2 hours of electric operation. The average fire call in the US is about 22 minutes. So we got roughly 4 times, a little more than 4 times the amount of the average fire call. But because we can't just let the truck die in the middle of a fire, the system we have in place, we have a range extender on the truck. And so when the batteries get to 20%, this little 6-cylinder, 3-liter, it's a BMW diesel engine, kicks in and recharges the batteries. We have a 33-gallon diesel tank on it. And so that gives us another 6 to 8 hours of operation. So at that time, you either need to plug it in, or you do what we do today on a fire scene, and we got to bring the fuel truck out and we refuel it. That being said, we do have several trucks in service, and we talked about big data. We are collecting the data. The one I'm going to reference is in Berlin. They've had their truck for several months now. They've got about 6,000 miles on it. They run a little over 500 calls. And the data in that shows that 95% of those calls were for incidents other than fires. Only 5% actually engaged the fire pump, and only once did that range extender kick in. So 99.8% of their calls have been emission free. So the range anxiety, I think we've come up with a good solution to solve that, and firefighters are certainly taking note.
As a EV driver, I think quote unquote range anxiety, or as I say, range uncertainty, tends to go away really fast once you own one and once you drive one. But perception matters. And so it is something where we have to help solve the perception of range issues. But the reality is that it's really something that goes away super quickly. Kara, I'm interested as you guys have looked at the sort of infrastructure development and the role of the city, how are you all sort of thinking about what role you do? And you mentioned streetlights and some things that probably people weren't even thinking about, that you could use streetlights as a way to provide charging infrastructure. But how are you all thinking about your approach to infrastructure in the city of Racine, and kind of giving EVs for everyone and access for everyone?
We're focusing first on the locations where we have control. And so that's why we led with our City Hall parking lot. We kind of thought about where best to put in a public EV charging station, and we thought about the studies that we could conduct. And then we just said, well, eventually we want to be charging our own fleet vehicles. But until then, until we have any, we want to offer this service right here, right in front of our City Hall. And so that's where we focused first. And then since then, there's been a tremendous amount of interest from our downtown district, from our uptown district, from our library, from community centers. And there are certainly many places where we could install charging stations that are grid tied very cheaply right now, but we opted for a standalone solar unit to really send a message that we're committed to carbon neutrality and that Mayor Corey Mason is committed to carbon neutrality for the city of Racine. And that also this unit can serve as an auxiliary power unit for when we do intermittently lose electricity or we need electricity in our parking lot. And so we're focusing on our own municipally owned entities first, and then trying to rework some of our local ordinances and policies so that new construction, especially apartment complexes, include charging stations for their residents.
It's you brought up the idea of solar canopy charging approach, right? And I think one of the things that's super interesting about transportation electrification, one is, I mean, electricity is ubiquitous, right? It's like it's everywhere. You can find a plug all over the place, and in many ways, for 5 years, I basically just plugged into our garage outlet. Didn't even worry about adding a level 2 charger. And I think sometimes people have this idea that they have to go through this big sort of system upgrade to do that. But in reality, you can do a lot without doing that. But I think also the idea is that it's self-fueling is a really big deal. And even within the city context, even for some of those facilities, there's an opportunity to think about ways to bring power to your transportation system that doesn't actually have to be tied to the grid. And then amazingly, it'll get cleaner over time. And I think that's also the cool thing. And if you haven't seen it, Kara, the city of Denver recently did a study on a Nissan Leaf, and 3 years through its duty cycle, it's actually gotten cleaner. And that just can't exist. It is not possible with an internal combustion engine. And so that's a pretty amazing outcome. So, hey, I wanted to turn to Rosalyn. There's a question that came in the chat, and I'd encourage others, if they have questions, to bring up. We have a couple minutes to get some audience Q&A. But one of the questions was, and Carrie, you almost started to touch on it, is just how do we use existing infrastructure that may be currently underutilized to avoid costly upgrades in transformers and distribution equipment. And I don't know and I would offer that to both you and Pat, because I think you probably both have a view on that.
Sure. Well, Amply's approach would be to deploy our charging software, which would control the charging such to minimize demand, which for initial deployments would allow fleets to not have to upgrade their switchgear or have to deploy costly infrastructure in the beginning. That'll be something that would have to be discussed later. But while this is less of a concern for public fleets that tend to own their sites, for private fleets that might be leasing, this is a really important thing for them to consider if they don't think they'll be at that site or that warehouse for more than a few years. And so it's knowing how many vehicles you want to deploy now. Like Kara said, they knew that right now for their route analysis that 9 buses could serve what they needed. And so then working up from that is, okay, what's our next deployment? Is it going to be 18 buses? Is it going to be the full deployment? Are we going to just match the replacement cycle? And trying to build that out to see when you would need to actually engage with the utility more than just saying, hey, we're bringing large batteries to be on site and need charging every day. We actually need to bring this increased level of infrastructure to our site.
Great. Pat, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'll just build off what Rosalyn was saying, because I think part of it is, besides some of the strategy of operating that and charging that too, can go into the automation side, the charger management system. It's what Rosalyn's group does too. ABB's got automation too, where you can manage how you charge the equipment, and you could do it at faster rates, slower rates, depending on, obviously we can't go over what the battery on the vehicle allows us to, but you can curtail and do more sequential charging, more power sharing, different ways to help make sure that the fleet is ready to go back into service when needed, but be smarter about it. So when it comes in, they know when the state of charge of every vehicle comes in, and kind of figures out, how do we get these guys out back ready to go? And so it's a lot of exciting times, because that's a lot of collaboration is needed, but it can really help save on infrastructure too.
Great. There's a quick question about the power system in the small plant that was on the vehicle for the fire truck. So it was basically a 6-cylinder BMW engine, right? Is the way that that's coupled for your fire truck, Todd?
That is correct. And it's got a, I believe, 110 kilowatt basically generator attached to that diesel engine. And so, and that's more power than we can consume. So when that kicks in, it will charge the batteries as well as power the vehicle.
Great. All right, rapid fire, last question. These things always seem to go so quickly. So this time I'm going to start with you, Orville. What's the most important next step, for your company or your city to take to accelerate transportation electrification?
I touched on it earlier, and I think a lot of it's just the experience. So Lion has experience centers throughout the country, and we are actively working with state legislators, federal partners, to make sure that they get behind or they sit in one of our medium and heavy duty electric vehicles and get to ride it, get to drive it, get to see that these things are real and they are just an investment away from being part of your community. It's important that we get to all 50 states. We are dropping off Tennessee's first electric school bus this week. I think that's a huge moment in a state's history as we start talking about post-partisan when it comes to EVs, and really make sure that everyone starts to think about this as just good, sound economic policy, environmental policy, and health equity. So for me, I think it's just making sure that we make people experience it and that we get as many people behind the bus or on the bus and behind the driver's steering wheel as possible.
There's some kind of lions, tigers, and bears, oh my kind of thing that I feel like you got to wrap in there somehow too, just since we're using all kinds of puns, right? Pat, what's most important for ABB?
Well, a couple things for Wisconsin. Actually, ABB is committed in Wisconsin. We have a drives facility here, so we're building energy efficiency equipment right in Wisconsin. But from a charging technology and a charging and e-mobility supplier, the market's changing fast. The use cases are changing. We're trying to keep up with that and keep growing the value add to the operator and owner of the equipment, so we can enable more charging strategies and make it easier for people to plug in and know that the system's going to work every time they plug in their charger with their vehicle. So it's exciting times. Great time to be collaborating.
Great. I'm going from vehicle to infrastructure to vehicle. Todd, maybe the same question for you, and then Rosalyn, you can guess your next, and then we'll finish with the city.
Sure. And I guess I'll just kind of, couple on what Orville is saying. But yeah, for us, it's really about raising awareness. We're on a nationwide tour with our electric vehicle. So we had a legislative event out in DC a couple of weeks ago, getting legislators in the vehicle, and again experiencing that there is an electric fire truck out there. Later this year, we'll be delivering our first electric vehicle in North America to Los Angeles City. So there's a lot of excitement building around that. We have a lot of other municipalities that are getting close to placing orders. So I would say, for that, it's just raising awareness. And then a couple on that is ramping up our production facilities to meet the demand that is coming.
Great. We have a long history of working with Mayor Garcetti and Lauren Faber O'Connor and Michael Samuelon in the city, and they've been funded through, our work's been funded through Bloomberg Philanthropies, and part of the reason we get to do this kind of work. So excited to see that truck on the ground there.
Yeah, so we'll have a big launch event later this year, so we'd love to have you out there.
Great. Traveling seems like such a foreign concept as recent. But Rosalyn, what's the thought from Amply in terms of the priorities and how do we accelerate EVs?
Sure. So our priority is to continue to engage with the Electrification Coalition, among with others, with utilities, stakeholders, and policymakers to make this transition as easy as possible for fleets. Right now, there's a number of moving parts, whether it's the vehicle, the infrastructure, the getting enough power to the site. And we would like to continue to work with other stakeholders in this space to make it as simple as possible so that it's basically a checklist. Do you have the vehicles? Do you know what charging infrastructure you want? Do you know your charging strategy? And it can be rather cut and paste. Of course, each fleet and each sub part of a fleet, whether it's waste management or school buses or fire departments, they're going to have their own priorities in how they want to charge and how they want to deploy vehicles. But to some level, we can get to the standardization and operational excellence to make this transition as easy as just saying yes.
Perfect. And the table is set. Kara, bring us home.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. This has been so much fun, and I can't stress enough how important it is to get municipal staff in these vehicles. We would never have placed an order for Proterra buses if Proterra hadn't brought a bus to us in the city of Racine. We would never have an EV ARC if cities like Madison and Milwaukee hadn't taken leadership on this before. So all of these municipal staff, we talk to each other, we learn about best practices that other folks have, and we want to get our staff in these vehicles to show that they work. And I'll share a brief anecdote that our former city administrator was not sold on EVs at all. And I brought him to an event in Milwaukee and he test drove a little BMW and was shocked. His jaw dropped. He had no idea. He was thinking it was going to be a golf cart. So we need to keep changing these minds and building a more climate resilient